Hi folks, Keenan here over at Tales of Kaimere. I am a scientific illustrator and fantasy author. I'm way behind on my next Tales of Kaimere anthology, so I'm shifting my schedule around a little bit. For the next 2 weeks, I will be doing a Q&A to both save time on art and to show some appreciation for my Patreon supporters. My Patreon account is just for support and offers no exclusive features, since I don't want a paywall preventing folks from enjoying this project. That said, I do have bills to pay, and I'm very grateful for the support my patrons offer. Sponsorships and ad revenue also help, of course, and that's a great way to support the project, but I thought I'd devote these past 2 weeks to my supporters on Patreon. Without further ado, let's dive in. Brandon Borgos asks, how do you determine what adaptations are plausible for a creature to adapt to solve a problem, specifically how long it takes defensive traits like osteoderms, horns, spikes, venom, etc. to appear on a creature that doesn't already have them? I generally try to follow precedent set in nature. A common trend is for traits like these to develop early in a clade's history, back when they're small generalists, and become exaggerated over time. Early armadillos likely had independent osteoderms before their dermal armor formed. Early bovids had small protrusions before exaggerated horns evolved. Toxic saliva is presumed to have been the predecessor of venom in snakes. In simple terms, if the animal is dominant and specialized, it is very unlikely to make any changes other than size. An example of this is the dragons of the Permian Islands. Flight, horns, and venom all evolved very early in the clade, in which tiny arboreal predators hunted smaller prey than themselves. As they got larger in a vacant apex predator niche, their flight became more powerful, their horns exaggerated as display structures, and venom had become increasingly invested in as they had to kill a larger and more dangerous prey. That because of flight, they had to weaken before a kill rather than risk injury. Now that they are large specialists, even if they lost flight and became grounded, they are unlikely to develop dermal armor, as they are already large specialists and poorly positioned for such adaptations. Another example would be the Mylodont sloths back in the known world. They came to Kaimere already having tiny osteoderms scattered across their back and flanks. Despite being smaller, yet better defended sloths an edge over their megatheer cousins, and they eventually outcompeted them with the increased investment in armor over time. The Hukogor is not only the largest xenarthran to ever exist, with the largest males weighing between 8 and 12 tons, it also substantially invests in dermal armor because the smaller generalist ancestors already had the trait. Megatheer sloths didn't have dermal armor, and were already too derived by the time they had arrived in Kaimere. Daniel Wills asks, how long ago did you make the giant abyssal amphibians? I think I first designed the Zolanitok, or Steward of the Abyss, back in high school when I was making more or less Kaimere versions of all my favorite prehistoric creatures from documentaries I'd seen as a kid, in this case Walking with Dinosaurs. I put a temnospondyle in all sorts of crocodile niches throughout the colder regions, and the saltwater crocodile version of one basically became a sperm whale over time. It developed quite a lot since these early versions that are now, goodness, I think 15 years old since I designed this guy. He's one of the earlier Kaimere creatures, even though I haven't actually illustrated him beyond a sketch for Songs of the Inland Sea. Meant to do an episode on the creatures of the anthology, but had to prioritize sponsored topics. Might revisit it later. Toros asks, how would a resonating chamber like the ones Lambeosaurines had affect the vision of the silent ones? I mean, that's more or less what the big chamber in the front of their face does. It's filled with a waxy liquid similar to the melon in some cetaceans, although probably with a different consistency as it's a terrestrial animal. Hollow sections might be advantageous though, so perhaps it isn't entirely filled with wax. I don't know enough about the benefits of a hollow chamber like Lambeosaurines versus a semi-liquid chamber in this context, given the to give this question a proper answer, but it is something I'd like to give further consideration to. Kaiseror asks, is there an increasing number of episodes taking place outside the known world meant to reflect an in-universe increase in the Assembly taking more ambitious expeditions? That is definitely a part of it. It's only been within the last century or so that the Assembly has been permitted to send out large-scale exploratory missions, and only through very strict guidelines and regulations by the peoples of the Free States. It's a fun lens to develop these regions. From the meta perspective, the known world is where most of my stories take place, so that helps to be where I focus my developments. However, the planet is vast, and developing these regions is helping me perfect and refine the known world. For example, now that I've done research developing the serpentine rhynchocephalians, that's going to be a clade in the known world that I wouldn't have thought to make if I hadn't been designing them in the realms beyond. The Mogao is an example of me making these clades before having them develop in the known world, so the core idea isn't new or necessary, but having a more complete view of the world and its clades is helpful when I'm working on the known world. Alex Morehouse asks, are there any plans for the books to be released in an audiobook form? That is absolutely on the agenda. I actually spoke to a few friends and voice actors last year for a test run of one story, but unfortunately it fell through. Might have to do a Kickstarter or something to build up a budget first. As a backup, I'm hoping to eventually read all the stories and put them on YouTube so folks can listen to them for free and support future videos with ad revenue. But for now, I've got to prioritize sponsored video topics since that's not only what pays the bills, but it's also good to finalize a lot of the world building early in my publishing career. Since we know the portal can move things both ways, why didn't it try to repopulate Earth after its own mass extinctions? If and when the portal breaks free of the whistling door, what's it going to do? Also, how long does it take for information harvested by the portal to get from one world to the other? Very good question. To clear up some confusion, the portal was only able to take from Earth and copy onto Kaimere until a device called the Whistling Door, made by the first children, trapped the portal and not only allowed them to control when it opened or closed, but also in which direction it went. The portal's territory is only a small region in Kaimere. Even though it's all the same molecules and it could technically repopulate Earth, it didn't. The portal only cares about its own territory, and isn't going to take away from its territory to supplement Earth fauna. One could perhaps argue that it would be making its harvesting grounds more productive, likening it to planting seeds on Earth that it could later reap when it has to, but in its natural state the portal didn't think like that. If the Whistling Door were to be broken and the portal freed, there are many theories about how it might operate. It's now been programmed to not only take from Earth, but to give back. It might get stuck in a loop of replication and harvest in both territories, which could be an ecological collapse in both areas. Perhaps it would return to its original condition. Depending on how the door is broken, it might alter its primary territory to Earth, which could have disastrous consequences for whatever region it's settled into. In its natural state, the portal is estimated to take around a century for data to get from Earth to reach Kaimere. Now, it takes a matter of minutes, as estimated by taking a person around half an hour to leave Kaimere, turn around, and immediately come back through once the directions are manually altered. How the first children managed this is unknown, though modern assembly physicists assume quantum entanglement is involved. Deathwing 742 asks, curious if you plan on covering Therizinosaur and Dinocheirid varieties of dinosaur if they are around in Kaimere. Both lived in Asia during the Maastrichtian when the Tyrant Dynasty clades were primarily harvested, so both were at least at one point in Kaimere. As for having living descendants, I'm not sure. Probably not Therizinosaurs and Dinocheiris specifically. Large specialists like them are notoriously unlikely to survive. though they might be more basal generalists in their respective clades still in Hyrule. Definitely not in the known world. There are, however, a modern Thescelosaur genus in the known world that is convergently evolved to strongly resemble Deinocheirus. Anthony asks, the Jurassic Islands episode stood out to me. Why aren't there more dinosaurs more derived and bizarre? Islands and isolated landmasses typically produce very strange animals, and much of the life on the Jurassic Islands seems like they'd fit in typical dinosaur life. The sauropods especially seemed pretty typical to me. I still enjoyed the episode overall, I'm just curious. Oh, that's a good one. Unlike the Permian continent and islands, which went from tropical to temperate and even subpolar amidst many other changes, the Jurassic Islands have not only moved at a much slower rate, but also remained largely within the tropics and had a consistent flow of rain along their east coast, so even when the planet overall was quite arid, it would still be among the wettest places in Kaimere. This consistency in context is why fauna are quite basal compared to how derived the Permian regions are. While its core evolution is indeed a constant, and every generation comes with consistent mutations, if the context is the same, the new mutations are selected against. If the context changes, these mutations might be selected for. It's just how evolution works. The species on the Jurassic Islands are genetically derived as the Permian fauna have been since around the same time in the Jurassic, but the Permian regions look far more derived because the changes in their climate have been much more drastic, and therefore dramatic and overt mutations ended up being more successful. In a way, it's an example for me to highlight the importance of context. Great change is what allowed the residents of the Permian regions to survive, which is why so many of them look so different from their ancestors. Conversely, minimal change is what allowed the residents of the Jurassic Islands to survive, which is why most of them wouldn't stand out in a lineup of late Jurassic Laurasian taxa. The Siren Lord asks, you have discussed to some extent the oceans of the Tyrant and Permian dynasties, but what were the oceans like during the First Dynasty, and what is its legacy in the modern oceans of Kaimere? The oceans of the First Dynasty would have more than enough fauna to cover an episode, but I haven't developed them much. For the most part, the end of the First Dynasty was especially devastating to marine fauna. Much of the Abyss was unaffected, though, so while there are relics present in the deep, and I've even alluded to a few of them in my books and videos. The Abyss of Kaimere in general is a pretty fun location. The portal's territory does not include the deep oceans, so it's never collected from our abyss. Because of this, the deep oceans of Kaimere are populated by an entirely unique cast of deep-sea creatures, either abyssal residents that happen to be high in the water column when collected, like sleeper sharks, or coastal fauna that independently adapted to being in deep water. There's a lot more native Chimeran organisms down there than in most other regions on the planet. And that's it for today, folks. Thank you so much to my Patreon patrons for asking so many great questions. As I've said earlier, your support, along with the video sponsorships and commissions, is what allows me to make this project. Next week begins a series of 3 episodes that explore the first harvest following the dynastic extinction, and many of the relics of this harvest that persist in remote coastal forests of Arvel, now isolated by a vast desert. If you would like to support Tales of Kaimere, please do consider joining me on Patreon. A little bit really does go a long way. Thank you so much to my Patreons, and gratitude to you for watching. Cheers, folks!